Terry Brotherstone, as I said, is in essence going to be talking about the interesting difference now that potentially exists between England and Scotland on the question of governance.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. I find myself in the interesting position of being, only for the second time since the 1980s, able to start by saying, I agree more or less with the Vice-Chancellor. Although in this case, I would say it with the caveat that I do reserve the right to act in solidarity with my colleagues in UCU Salford. The previous occasion was when I had to speak at the Scottish TUC with Professor Ferdinand Prodzynski, the Vice-Chancellor of the Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, who chaired the committee on which I served about advising the Scottish Government on university governance reform. Just a couple of obiter dicta in relation to what Martin has said. I'm struck by the stress that's been put on the excellence of the Brighton programme that we heard about yesterday. A very similar, I think, certainly an intention thing took place in Aberdeen in the 1980s when a cultural history programme was set up. The difference being that the University of Aberdeen, being a small but of course research excellent university, shut it down as soon as it came to kind of press against the template on which they were operating. I also went to Cambridge earlier than Martin from a Scottish private school. I did know how to order a drink in a way that didn't make me stand out, but I did feel the oppression of the English public school presence there very much. And perhaps it accounts for the fact that, I'm sorry Colin Blakemore isn't here because he was a year ahead of me at college. He won't remember me as he ascended in his career to the Olympian heights of academic usefulness. Whereas I descended to the gutter of political and trade union activity. Although, as Oscar Wilde said, if you're in the gutter, you can at least look up at the stars. A number of things Martin was saying very much echoed with me personally, as well as the general thing, which is, I hope he doesn't think I'm wrong about, well, if I'm wrong about this, I'd like to know, but I think it's an unusual contribution to hear from a Vice-Chancellor in the current environment in the UK universities. Well, but I hope that it won't be considered too forensic to point out that the irrational and destructive of humanity in every sense of that word assault that's going on the universities in Britain at the moment is not the only thing that's happening in the United Kingdom. And the HEPI report by Tony Bruce in 2012, after the commission on which I was on reported, for the first time, I think, systematically drew attention to the divergent course that university systems are taking in the four nations of the United Kingdom, with Scotland being the particular standout example of something different. As that report tended to be presented, it certainly was in the higher, and there's some justification, I think, in the report itself for this, as saying that whereas England was embarking on the reasonable, globalized, rational course of development, Scotland was sacrificing its opportunity to have excellent universities to the social requirement of access and so forth. Although actually Scottish universities have a very bad record in access, as a matter of fact, overall. And they are in danger of being divided in government thinking, I think, into proper universities and social access universities. And that is something that very much has to be resisted, while at the same time, the possibility of a rational discussion about the variety of universities ought to be possible, particularly within Scotland, where everybody except Vice-Chancellors I think talks about a Scottish university system. Vice-Chancellors talk about my institution and how it's going to compete on the world market. So as Scotland moves towards its referendum on constitutional independence, which has been kind of noticed from time to time south of the border, I think more attention needs to be paid to this different course taken by HE policy, and it's important not only for the sake of universities but for the sake of the whole debate about what sort of society people want. Because if Scots were to, through various accidents of political developments that might happen in the meantime, vote for independence, so-called, then it would not be because they are suddenly become rabid nationalists. Only a minority is in that situation. possibly a dangerous minority. But it would be because they believe it might be possible for Scotland to still, even as Stockholm explodes, become a kind of Scandinavian model social democracy, maintaining the welfarist attitudes that have been so important since the Second World War. And indeed were important before. Not, I think, because of any moral virtue amongst Scots, but because the social problems of Scotland were so great in the 19th century, even by Manchester standards, and Engels himself, in a footnote, notices that, that even the middle classes were very much concerned that there is such a thing as society, and they had to take responsibility for it. Just to say how the von Brotzyński report was set up, when I said yesterday, not in a critical spirit, but as an observation that I thought not many people here, despite their expertise, would have actually read it, I wasn't exactly drowned in a flood of denial, but a few wavelets of protest did come over my ankles. So those who have read it, I hope, will contribute to helping me out and saying something I've got an instinct about, but no very concrete idea. I think it would greatly benefit the discussions that we symbolise here if the Scottish case were actually incorporated into a much broader discussion about the United Kingdom. And there is this historic moment in Scotland. I don't really belong to the theory that it's the greatest historic decision since 1707 that's about to be made. But I do think there's a moment where those who do want to promote the independence cause have created conditions in which they have to now enter into the sort of debate about what sort of society people want. And if people were to vote for independence, it would be for the reasons I've said. And I think both the Yes and the No campaign are now in a competition to decide who can best answer Mrs. Thatcher's no such thing as society comment. So to begin with some historical reflections, as a background to how von Brotzyński came to be set up, and Professor von Brotzyński, who'd come more or less straight from the City University in Dublin, was, I think, selected because he wasn't part of the Scottish educational establishment. I don't think that was a very popular decision with the Scottish educational establishment. But obviously, if you're not Scots and you are Irish, that's kind of the second best thing if you live north of the border. Indeed, maybe they're even better than us because they had a proper fight for independence, even if it was only partially realised. So I'm not here to say that Scotland is good and England is bad. Very far from it. There's lots of bad things about Scotland, and the same problems are basically faced. The whole pressure of the so-called globalised economy, the economy of globalised capital, as I would prefer to call it, and both of the systems are under very much the same pressure. But the decision by the SNP early in 2011 to campaign in the elections to the Scottish Parliament, they'd already been a minority government for 4 years and had, to everyone's surprise, not done too badly. Well, that was the general perception. The decision to campaign on a manifesto that included a commitment not to charge Scottish domiciled students for tuition. The First Minister's statement made in an exuberant moment at the opening of the Burns Centre in Ayrshire that the rocks would melt in the sun before he would allow any Scot to have to pay for their education. This created certain problems for them when very unexpectedly they won an overall majority in the proportional representation parliament that there is at Holyrood. Now, the universities in Scotland, the education system and the university in particular, have played a major role in the country's history and in the process leading up to legislative devolution in 1997, 1999 particularly. The university system was devolved long before substantially before political decision-making were. It has, of course, three of the four Scottish universities are after Oxford and Cambridge, the oldest in the United Kingdom. The English bourgeoisie was terrified of universities at the time when other people saw them as instruments of social control, I think. The aristocracy tended to go wild if they had a bit of a university experience. The and indeed, if you look at how the process of devolution occurred, I mean, you really have to go back to the late 19th century, and then it was for the first time decided that Scotland, having preserved at the time of the Union its major social institutions, the church, the education system, even local government and so on, and the legal system, required a separate department of government. So the Scottish Office was first actually called the Scotch Education Office. That's where it really came from, the Scotch Education Office within the Home Office. So that these, in a sense, the question that's going to be asked in the referendum is, should Scotland be an independent country? In many respects, of course, it already is an independent country, and that's why devolution was so easy. It was far from a revolutionary process. Once Mrs. Thatcher had convinced people that Scotland was a separate nation in the 1980s, the referendum produced the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government, but it was really just a question of transferring the Scottish Office of the UK Parliament and all its functions to Edinburgh and making it answerable to an assembly in Edinburgh and not to the Westminster Parliament. So it was a very simple process. And it, far from doing what Labour hoped, which was to kill nationalism dead, it's actually led to a process where nationalism, now seen as a better form of social democracy, is at least in a position to hold its referendum. Although it's finding it very difficult to answer the sort of questions that people are really asking. Just before the 2011 election, the government itself, government ministers, nationalist government ministers, had been very critical of universities. There had been a series of scandals, some of them open, some of them not. The helicopters were sent in against occupying students at the Hetherington Institute at the University of Glasgow. The principal there was in open conflict with his Senate and his colleagues, as they still like to call themselves. At the University of Aberdeen, there was a huge dispute between the retiring Vice-Chancellor, and there were a whole series of things actually going on in the background that didn't get such publicity. And above all, the annual announcement of Vice-Chancellor's salaries had become a kind of moment of scandal where the nature of universities impacted on public opinion and so forth. And statements had been made by politicians about that. So after winning the majority, the government was faced with a kind of various problems to deal with. The Cabinet Secretary, Michael Russell, that's what they call ministers, not the civil servants, it's rather confusing, he did a number of things about universities. First of all, he recognised the trade union campaign that had gone on, and that is important. We decided in 2007, when the Nationalists were first elected, that we were not going to adopt the kind of initial knee-jerk labour movement reaction of playing on their house, but we actually engaged with them, and we actually said trade unions are about policy making, they're not only about the defence of their members. We held two major conferences, one in deference to a certain myth about Scottish intellectual traditions called Intellect and Democracy, a second done in joint with the EIS, the other higher education union in Scotland. The union situation's different there. We're called the Future of Higher Education in Scotland. We also were lobbying for reform of governance and a move away from managerial, or at least an attempt to change the trajectory away from rampant managerialism to sensibly organised collegial management, and to deal with questions like differentials and so forth. So Russell conceded to this and set up this extraordinary, what would have been by Westminster standards, an extraordinary commission that included me as a trade union nominee, not a representative, but nominee. We were all independent people. The Vice-Chancellor, the rector, the student-elected rector, this is a peculiar Scottish office, of Edinburgh University, and the president of the National Union of Students, Scotland. And on the other side, as it were, Alan Simpson, the chair of court at Stirling and the chair of chairs of Scottish courts. He was the dissident throughout the discussions, as Professor von Prodzynski proved to be surprisingly open to new ideas, and to student and staff opinion. I think he'd been told to be so by Russell, and was favourable, was that sort of person himself. The second question, so he set up this commission on governance, which seemed like a technical question, but did develop into something rather broader. he also had to deal with the question of what we call RUK, rest of the UK fees. And that he went in a completely opposite direction. He went for the full neoliberal answer. Had to be, everyone expected a bit of a rise to stop free refugees from England, but the nationalists had abolished fees already for Scottish students in 2007, but there was a fee for non-domiciled Scots who were not from the EU, and he went for the £9,000 cap and for it to go to individual universities, not to a common pot. So that was that, and along with the funding settlement, in which he it's not quite as simple as this, but he basically took money out of further education in order to satisfy the Vice Chancellors that they were getting a good deal for the universities. Well, the kind of discussions on von Prodzynski that we had were quite wide-ranging, and I would claim the report is actually readable, as opposed to the sort of reports that Professor Collini has so brilliantly criticised in the London Review of Books that have emanated from the English establishment since the beginning of the century, and perhaps before. That it is historically intelligent, that it does talk a bit about the historical background to all this and to difference and so on, and says that does matter. There is a Scottish university system, and Vice Chancellors should be answerable to it, to its needs. When I say Vice Chancellors, I mean management, that there is this myth of the democratic intellect, the idea that it's the kind of version of the ploughboy to the professor or minister or whatever it was thing. It is largely unverifiable in terms of actual statistics, or only marginally so, but it was a tradition that means something. So there's the idea, first of all, that philosophy is the queen of the sciences, that the four-year degree allows for general knowledge, general approach to be developed, and individual sciences then to be located within a much broader concept of humane knowledge. I'm not saying this works very well now, but that's the tradition. And secondly, that it was kind of more democratic. Well, we set about to address what was sometimes referred to as a dual democratic deficit. That was to say that there's a democratic deficit within universities because senates have been largely disempowered, courts act as business bodies, and with very little consultation, and are largely dominated by, for practical purposes, by businessmen who see it as their role basically to endorse what managements tell them needs to be done. If to press them at all, to press them in a direction of commercialization rather than academic freedom. It was striking, the evidence that was submitted to the committee, which very much confirmed what a colleague of mine has described as the dual narrative in universities, the narrative of management, that all the successful league tables are there to be climbed up, and climbing up is going on, although they've recently gone down a bit actually, that we punch above our weight in Scotland, that we get, with 8% of the population, get 15% of the research grant, etc., etc. That students by and large express satisfaction in surveys, all these kinds of things. That's the one story. The other story is from unions, from individuals who gave evidence to the Commission that we've been disenfranchised, we have no say in how the universities run, that we're under stress, that courses are closed without proper consultation, etc., etc. The issues that have been proved most controversial is that von Prodzynski is very strong on autonomy and academic freedom, but also makes the essential distinction that Will Hutton was having, I think, some difficulty with yesterday, that whereas certainly when I started fighting cuts in universities in the early 80s, we used to use these two terms almost synonymously. Now, autonomy is actually the enemy in many respects of academic freedom. If autonomy is interpreted as it is by management, largely as the right to do what we think with a commercial agenda. And so far from, and then, of course, research exercises and all the rest of it mean that people can't exercise academic freedom. I know I'm running short of time, Tom. Can't exercise academic freedom because they're told what they have to do, and it has to make money or raise prestige in some institutionally determined way. We wanted to introduce an elective principle of a practical sort. Rejected, I can come back to this, the idea of electing vice-chancellors, the Trinity College Dublin model, but said that, but recommended that chairs of court should be elected, and that could build on this Scottish tradition of ancient universities, at least, of having a rector who's elected on by campus, that he should be paid or she should be paid that, a modest amount, but enough so that the social profile of such people could expand and it wouldn't just be the well-paid businessmen who could do the job. That's proved one of two of the important questions. We couldn't really deal with salaries, although in the public prints it was commonly assumed that we were going to, and we did recommend student and staff representative on remuneration committees and pay tribute to the fact that the really exponential growth of wage differentials in universities and politicians have been questioning vice-chancellors and governors on that, is really makes it impossible to talk about a collegial community anymore, really. I used to get on very well with the Vice-Chancellor in Aberdeen throughout the late 80s and 90s, and he would always try and say, we really agree, there's no difference between us. And I used to think, well, the difference between us, Duncan, is about 150,000 a year. We recommended that there should be trade unionists elected as trade unionists on court, something I think used to be ambiguous about, but it had become a kind of symbolic thing, that courts should meet in public unless there is genuine confidential business, that the gender balance question should be addressed, that there should be a national advisory forum in which questions could be raised, such as if one institution is closing down foreign languages on the grounds that there's another that can do it. Is that really? Yeah, 3 minutes. I thought it was. I'm actually 2 minutes over already, so that's very generous. That there should be a research institute. I know that some research has begun because we found there was very little solid information, and the tendency of the vice-chancellors and the governors was to say, oh, we've got all the information, but it's not information that's accessible for serious research. That there should be a new Universities Act, the government wanted that, and that there has to be serious addressing of the kind of idea that there could be regional universities and national proper universities and so on. So there are really two levels of discourse, and if people ask me questions, I can tell you what stage we're at now. The chairs of court were given, against our advice, the right to produce a new code of governance, and they've tried to use that exercise in many ways, I think, to undermine the report. So there's the kind of immediate battle that's going on, and Prodzynski has become a kind of a good thing in terms of trade union campaigning and so on. And we do need a critique, and the report needs a serious critique from the left, that is one thing I'm really saying in producing it here. But secondly, there's the idea that there is this moment of discourse, and is it possible for a small country with to develop a different model of universities that actually fights against this so-called there is no alternative, and we've all got to compete with Hong Kong and Singapore, and we'll be probably competing with them on civil rights very soon as well, I think, if we go down that route. So there's a number of other things I'd like to say, but I've actually got through most of it, I think. As I say, I seek help in the idea that is my instinct right, that what's going on in Scotland ought to be much more in the consciousness of those who are campaigning against the full onslaught of the neoliberal agenda in England. And secondly, if that instinct is right, how might we produce some practical ideas as to make it a serious question? Thank you very much.